In an isolated mansion, two little twin girls of only 2 years old, sick and exhausted, are forced by their own father to clean every corner of the enormous mansion every day without rest or affection. One day, while they cry alone, the purebred white horse that belongs to the rich man observes everything through the window and senses that something is very wrong. The animal realizes that the girls' situation is critical. Due to the inhumane conditions the little ones were in, they were getting sicker and sicker. On a stormy night, the twins, locked in a room and moaning with fever, can't resist and faint. The horse sees everything through the window, and what it does in the following minutes is so risky and tense that it defies all comprehension. Before we begin, if you, like us, love animals, subscribe now to our channel so you don't miss any emotional stories. Thank you. Now, let's get back to our story. The sound of small, shuffling footsteps echoed through the mansion's marble hallway, breaking the heavy silence of the pre-dawn hours. Two tiny figures moved slowly, each dragging a cleaning rag that seemed larger than their own bodies. Maya and Lena, twins of just 2 years, walked with the silent determination of those who'd already learned that resistance brought even worse consequences. The fever made their small faces glow with an unnatural flush, and their little hands trembled as they tried to clean the cold floor. Maya, a few minutes older than her sister, occasionally glanced at Lena with a concern that shouldn't exist in eyes so young. When Lena stumbled, Maya would steady her with a strength that was startling for her age, whispering words of encouragement that sounded like an angel's whispers. The luxury of the mansion contrasted cruelly with the girls' reality. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling like frozen tears, while antique furniture and Persian rugs created an environment of opulence they could never enjoy. For Maya and Lena, this house was not a home, but an endless labyrinth of impossible tasks and cruel expectations. Through the panoramic window that overlooked the pastures, a white horse watched the scene with an unusual intensity. Its dark eyes seemed to understand something that the humans around pretended not to see. Majestic and imposing, the animal had been bought for a fortune by the mansion's owner, but had never shown the man any affection. Now, however, its attention was entirely focused on the two small figures struggling against exhaustion. The twins noticed the horse, and for a brief moment, their faces lit up with something akin to hope. Maya raised a trembling little hand and waved timidly. The horse responded with a gentle nod of its head, as if it perfectly understood the gesture. Lena let out a muffled giggle, the first sound of genuine joy to echo through the mansion in weeks. But the magic of the moment was shattered by the heavy sound of boots from the floor above. The footsteps descended the mahogany staircase with a cadence that made the girls' hearts race. They looked at each other with the mutual fear of those who shared a terrible secret. Their father was awake, and that never meant anything good. Richard Sterling was a man who had built a financial empire with the same coldness with which he treated his own daughters. Tall, with broad shoulders and perfectly combed graying hair, he descended the stairs with the posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His expensive suit, even at this early hour, was immaculate, like a suit of armor against any trace of humanity that might try to surface. His eyes found the girls in the hallway, and a look of disapproval settled on his face. To him, these children were not daughters, but constant reminders of a past mistake he preferred to forget. The death of his wife in childbirth had left a bitter mark on his heart, and in some twisted way, he blamed the twins for his own pain. Maya and Lena instinctively shrank back, their small bodies trembling not just from fever, but from the terror their father's presence always inspired. They knew, even at their tender age, that they needed to look busy, useful, invisible. The silence stretched like a cord about to snap. Outside, the white horse took a few steps toward the window, its hooves making a soft sound on the damp grass of the pasture. It was as if it sensed that something was about to happen, something that would forever change the fate of these two little souls who had touched its heart in ways it couldn't comprehend. The storm gathering on the horizon seemed to echo the growing tension inside the mansion, where two different worlds were about to collide irreversibly. Richard stopped on the last step of the staircase, his presence filling the hallway like a menacing shadow. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken expectations and very real fears. Maya and Lena remained motionless, their small bodies taut like violin strings about to break. "You're not finished yet." Richard's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. There was no shouting, no burst of anger, just a calculated coldness that was, in some ways, even more terrifying. The girls lowered their eyes, unable to meet his gaze without trembling. Maya, with the desperate courage of an older sister, tried to form words. Daddy, we..." But her voice died in her throat as he approached. The fever was making her vision blur, and she had to lean against the wall to keep from swaying. "I don't want to hear excuses." Richard walked slowly around them, like a predator examining its prey. "You know the rule. The work must be finished before dawn, always." Lena, even smaller and more fragile, began to sob quietly. Tears streamed down her feverish face as she clutched the dirty rag to her chest. Maya, even while battling her own weakness, reached out a small hand to find her sister's, offering the only comfort she could. Outside, the white horse had moved even closer to the window. Its intelligent eyes captured every nuance of the scene unfolding inside the mansion. Something primitive and protective stirred in its chest, an instinct it didn't know it possessed. Its hooves nervously pawed at the ground, creating a restless rhythm that echoed through the early morning. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." Richard's command made the twins lift their eyes, trembling. He saw in them not the daughters he might have loved, but ghosts of a happiness that had been snatched from him. "Your mother spoiled you. Now you'll learn what responsibility means." The words fell like stones on the girls' hearts. They barely remembered their mother, only vague fragments of warmth and affection that seemed like a distant dream. Maya felt a strange ache in her chest whenever she tried to recall those memories, as if something precious had been lost forever. "Finish this hallway, then clean the main living room. And I don't want to see a single smudge when I inspect it in the morning." Richard adjusted the cuffs of his shirt with precise movements, each gesture a demonstration of absolute control. "Remember, useful girls eat, useless girls don't." The man walked away, but his presence lingered like a heavy cloud over the sisters. They waited until the sound of his footsteps had completely faded before moving again. Maya wiped Lena's tears with a tenderness that contrasted painfully with the cruelty they had just witnessed. "Come on, Lena," Maya whispered, her voice a thread of determination in the midst of despair. "We can do it together. We always do." The two resumed their work with a synchrony born of necessity. Each movement was calculated to save energy, each pause measured so as not to provoke more anger. The heavy rag dragged across the marble floor, leaving streaks of clean that would soon be inspected with critical, merciless eyes. Through the window, the horse remained on silent vigil. There was something profoundly wrong in this house, something its animal instinct recognized even when the humans around chose to ignore it. It struck the ground with its hoof one more time, a gesture that felt like a promise, though not even the horse knew for what. In the kitchen, Clara, the mansion's cook, prepared breakfast with trembling hands. She had overheard the exchange in the hallway, and her heart felt as heavy as lead. A simple, middle-aged woman, Clara had worked at the mansion for over 10 years, but had never witnessed anything as cruel as the treatment of the twins. Her whispered prayers mixed with the steam rising from the pots. "Lord," she murmured as she stirred the oatmeal, "protect these innocent children. Don't let them suffer any more than they already have." But Clara knew her prayers, however sincere, were not enough. She had to find the courage to do something more concrete, something that could truly make a difference in the girls' lives. The fear of losing her job, however, weighed on her chest like a stone. When the first ray of sunlight touched the mansion's windows, Maya and Lena were still working, their small shadows moving slowly across the polished floor. The approaching storm would bring more than just rain. It would bring changes that none of them could foresee. The morning arrived with a pale sun that could barely pierce the heavy clouds gathering in the sky. Maya and Lena had finished their chores just before dawn, but exhaustion was etched onto their small faces. The fever persisted, leaving their cheeks red and their eyes glazed with fatigue. Clara watched the girls from the kitchen doorway, her heart breaking with every little stumble, every pause to take a difficult breath. She had prepared warm oatmeal and fresh milk, hoping her employer would allow the children a proper meal. But she knew Richard well enough to know that compassion was not part of his vocabulary. "Girls," she called softly, beckoning them to approach. Her voice carried all the maternal tenderness they rarely received. "Come here. Let Aunt Clara see how you are." Maya took Lena's hand, and the two slowly made their way to the kitchen. Clara knelt to be at their level, and what she saw made her swallow a sob. The little ones were visibly ill, their simple clothes sticking to their small bodies, sweaty from the fever. "Good heavens," Clara murmured, gently touching Maya's forehead. "You're burning up." She glanced around, making sure Richard wasn't nearby, and quickly served 2 small bowls of oatmeal. "Eat quickly, before he comes down." The twins ate with a desperate hunger that broke Clara's heart. She noticed how their little hands trembled as they held the spoons, as if even this simple act required a Herculean effort. Between spoonfuls, Lena began to cough, a dry, painful cough that made Clara automatically make the sign of the cross. From outside the kitchen window, the white horse appeared, as if it knew something important was happening. Clara noticed how the girls' eyes lit up when they saw it, and how they waved timidly, even in their discomfort. "He likes you, doesn't he?" Clara observed, trying to bring a moment of lightness to the somber morning. "He's a special animal, this one. I've never seen him take an interest in anyone in the house, but with you, it's different." Maya nodded weakly. "He's our friend," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the fever. "When Daddy yells, he gets mad too." The simplicity of the child's observation made Clara realize something the adults had missed. The horse wasn't just an indifferent animal, it was genuinely concerned for the girls. It was as if it recognized in them a vulnerability that awakened its protective instincts. The sound of heavy footsteps on the floor above cut the moment of tranquility short. Clara quickly collected the bowls and gently nudged the girls out of the kitchen. "Go! Go," she whispered urgently, "and remember, Aunt Clara is always here for you, okay?" Richard came down the stairs with his usual punctuality, already dressed in an impeccable suit for another day of business. His eyes scanned the house with the critical gaze of an inspector, searching for flaws he could use as an excuse for more punishment. The twins stood in a corner of the living room, trying to make themselves invisible. Richard walked past them without a glance, but his presence was enough to make their small bodies stiffen with fear. "Clara," he called from the dining room, "my coffee, and make sure those two have something to do. Idle hands are the devil's workshop." The cook served the coffee with hands that trembled slightly with suppressed indignation. "Yes, sir," she replied, but her words carried a weight that did not go unnoticed by the girls. After Richard left for another day at work, Clara gathered the courage to do something she had been planning for days. She went to the back room where John, the property's gardener, slept. John was a man of few words, but Clara knew he had also noticed the children's suffering. "John," she called softly, knocking on his door, "we need to talk." The gardener, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and a soft heart, opened the door with a worried expression. He had spent a sleepless night, disturbed by the sounds coming from the main house, the muffled crying, the shuffling footsteps, the whispers of fear. "It's about the girls, isn't it?" John didn't even need Clara to explain. "I know, Clara, I know, and it's killing me inside." The two employees looked at each other with the complicity of those who shared a heavy burden. They knew something had to be done, but they also knew the risks involved. Richard was a powerful man, with connections that stretched throughout the region. Defying him could mean not only the loss of their jobs, but also reprisals that could affect their own families. But as they spoke in whispers, a third presence watched them from the window. The white horse had approached the house once more, and its intelligent eyes seemed to capture the urgency of their conversation. It was as if it knew that changes were coming, and that its own part in this story was just beginning. The wind began to blow harder, carrying with it the smell of rain and the promise of a storm that would be much more than just meteorological. The following days brought a routine of suffering that seemed to intensify with each dawn. The twins' fever showed no signs of abating, but Richard remained inflexible in his demands. Maya and Lena were woken before sunrise, their small hands already calloused from the harsh rags and cleaning chemicals that irritated their delicate skin. It was during one of these torturous mornings that a ritual was born, one that would become the only source of hope in the girls' lives. While cleaning the large panoramic window in the living room, the white horse approached from the other side of the glass. Maya, nearly fainting from weakness, rested her hand on the cold pane. To her surprise and delight, the horse touched its muzzle to the exact spot where her small palm rested. "Lena, look," Maya whispered, her voice weak but filled with an emotion she hadn't felt in a long time. "He's talking to us." Lena, even with her eyes glazed over from the fever, managed a smile. She too placed her little hand on the glass, and the horse stood there, motionless, as if it understood the importance of that moment. It was as if an invisible bridge had been built between two worlds, that of human cruelty and that of animal compassion. From that day on, every afternoon as the sun began to set, the twins would find an excuse to clean that specific window, and there he would be, always at the same time, waiting for them. The horse would stand still for long minutes, its dark eyes fixed on the girls' faces, as if wanting to transmit all the strength and courage they needed. Clara was the first to notice the ritual. Watching from the kitchen, she saw how the girls' faces transformed in those precious moments. Pain gave way to hope, fear dissolved into pure joy. It was as if, for a few minutes each day, they became just children again. "It's a miracle," Clara would murmur to herself, making the sign of the cross. "That animal has a bigger heart than most people I know." John had also noticed the horse's unusual behavior. As the gardener, he knew the estate's animals well, but he had never seen anything like this. The horse, which had always been independent and aloof, now seemed to have a mission. It would graze near the house, always alert, like a silent guardian. "You know what's strangest?" John commented to Clara during a coffee break. "That horse never gave the boss the time of day. As expensive as he was, I never saw the creature show him any affection. Now, With the girls, he shook his head in disbelief. It's like a different animal. The situation at home was deteriorating rapidly. Richard, pressured by problems in his business, took out his frustration on his daughters with increasing cruelty. The chores multiplied, the shouting became more frequent, and the girls' food was reduced as a form of discipline. Maya began to show more severe symptoms. Her little hands trembled constantly, and she had to lean on the walls to keep from falling. Lena, always more fragile, developed a cough that woke her up at night, startling even Richard with its intensity. It was on one of those nights that something happened that would change everything. Lena, woken by another coughing fit, began to cry softly. Maya, though barely able to stand, hugged her sister and carried her to the window. Outside, as if it had heard a silent call, the white horse appeared. In the moonlight, the animal looked almost ghostly. It approached the window and, for the first time, made a sound, a low, melodic nicker that sounded like a lullaby. The girls stopped crying instantly, mesmerized by the nocturnal serenade. "He's singing to us," Lena whispered, her voice full of childish wonder, and it truly seemed like he was. The horse continued its song for a few minutes, a sound that echoed across the property like a prayer lifted to the heavens. Clara, woken by the unusual noise, peeked out her bedroom window and witnessed the most touching scene she had ever seen. The nicker also woke Richard, who came downstairs angrily, ready to silence the animal. But when he reached the living room and saw his daughters huddled by the window, watching the horse with a peaceful expression he hadn't seen on their faces in a long time, something stirred in his hardened chest. For a moment, just a moment, Richard remembered how his wife used to sing to the girls when they were babies. The memory hurt like a stab wound, and he quickly suppressed it. But the damage was done. A small crack had formed in the armor of coldness he had built around his heart. Richard went back upstairs without a word, leaving the girls with their nocturnal friend. But Clara, who had quietly come down to see what was happening, noticed something different in his eyes. It was confusion, pain, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something that could be remorse. The horse continued its vigil until the girls finally fell asleep, leaning against the window. Only then did it move away, walking slowly back to the pasture, like a guardian angel returning to its watch. That night, for the first time in months, Maya and Lena slept without nightmares. The second week brought changes no one could have predicted. The rains began to fall more frequently, and with them came an unease that seemed to contaminate the entire estate. The white horse showed growing signs of agitation, pacing nervously in the pasture, its eyes always fixed on the mansion, where its little friends continued their daily struggle for survival. Maya had lost an alarming amount of weight. Her simple clothes, already plain, now seemed too large for her frail little body. Lena was no better. Her cough had intensified, and dark circles had begun to appear under her eyes, unmistakable signs of extreme exhaustion. It was on a particularly difficult morning that Clara made a decision that would change her life forever. She watched the girls stumble through their cleaning, saw Maya carry Lena when she could no longer walk on her own, and something inside her simply broke. "Enough," she murmured to herself, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Enough of pretending I don't see. Enough of hiding behind fear." Clara went to John's room with the determination she hadn't felt in years. The gardener was getting ready for another day's work when she knocked urgently on his door. "John, I can't take it anymore," she said as soon as he opened the door. "These children are going to die if we don't do something, and I won't be able to live with myself if that happens." John looked into Clara's eyes and saw the same torment that kept him awake every night. He nodded slowly, the decision already made before she had even finished speaking. "What do you suggest?" he asked, his voice heavy with resolve. "There's Dr. Evans in town." Clara began to lay out a plan she'd been mulling over for days. "He's a veterinarian, but he also treats people when they need it. He's a good man, John. If we can get the girls to him..." "But how? The boss won't let them leave the property." John pointed out the obvious difficulty. Clara glanced out the window, where the white horse was pacing restlessly in the pasture. "Maybe we don't need his permission," she said, a wild idea beginning to form in her mind. While the two employees plotted their quiet rebellion, Richard was having the worst day of his professional life. An unexpected audit at his company had revealed irregularities that could cost him a fortune. Sitting in his office in the city, he felt the weight of his problems crashing down on his shoulders like boulders. But it was strange. Amidst all the financial turmoil, images of his daughters kept flashing in his mind. The way they hugged each other when they were scared, how Maya protected Lena even while sick, how they looked at him with a mixture of terror and hope that he pretended not to see. "Focus," he muttered to himself, trying to push away thoughts he considered weak and unnecessary. They need to learn to be strong, like I did." But the truth was, Richard had learned to be strong by suppressing every trace of vulnerability in himself. His wife's death had been the final straw in a life already marked by loss and disappointment. He had decided that love was a weakness, that affection was a luxury he couldn't afford. Back at the mansion, the twins were enduring another hellish day. The task at hand was to clean the attic, a dusty, suffocating space where old furniture and objects Richard preferred to forget were stored. Climbing the narrow stairs was already a challenge for their wobbly legs, and the thin air in the attic made Lena cough non-stop. It was there that Maya made a discovery that would mark her forever. Among dusty boxes, she found a photo album. With trembling hands, she opened it and saw pictures of a beautiful woman holding two babies, her and Lena. "Mommy," Maya whispered. Gently touching one of the photos, Lena drew closer, and the two stared, fascinated, at the images of a time they couldn't remember, but that their hearts recognized. In the photos, there was also a smiling man, Richard, but a version of him that seemed like a completely different person. His eyes shone with genuine joy, his arms wrapped around his wife and daughters with palpable tenderness. "Daddy was happy," Lena observed with the simple wisdom of a child. "Dude, what happened to him?" Maya wondered aloud, a deep sadness settling in her small heart. The twins spent the rest of the afternoon looking at the photos, absorbing every detail of the happy family they once were. It was as if they were meeting versions of themselves that had been lost in time, versions that were loved and protected instead of punished and ignored. When the sun began to set, they came down from the attic, carrying the album like a treasure. As always, they went to the window for their daily meeting with the white horse, but today there was something different in their eyes, a new understanding, a deeper sadness, but also a hope that hadn't been there before. The horse sensed the change immediately. It pressed its muzzle against the glass more insistently, as if it wanted to break through to comfort them. Its knickers sounded louder than usual, echoing across the property like a lament that reached the ears of Clara and John. "He knows," Clara said, watching the scene from the kitchen. "That animal knows something has to change." John nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll make it happen, no matter what it costs." The storm gathering on the horizon seemed to reflect the emotional turmoil gripping the estate. Changes were coming, and no one would emerge from this story the same. The third week began with a storm that seemed to herald greater misfortunes. The dark clouds gathered in the sky like grim omens, and the wind howled through the cracks of the mansion, creating a melancholy symphony that echoed the mood of everyone on the property. Maya and Lena could barely stand. The fever had intensified to the point of making them delirious at night. Whispering names they didn't know, and crying out for a mother they only vaguely remembered from the photographs found in the attic. Their small hands were raw and chapped from the chemicals, and their clothes clung to their sweaty bodies. Clara made a desperate decision. For the first time in her 10 years working at the mansion, she decided to confront Richard directly. She waited for him to finish breakfast and, with her heart pounding like a war drum, she approached the dining table. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to talk to you about the girls." Richard looked up from his newspaper with an expression of irritation. "What about them, Clara? Are they misbehaving again?" "They're sick, sir, very sick." Clara swallowed hard, mustering all the courage she possessed. "They need a doctor, urgently." The silence that followed was as taut as a rope about to break. Richard folded his newspaper slowly, his movements deliberately calm in a way Clara knew and feared. "Clara," he said finally, his voice dangerously low, "are you forgetting your place in this house?" "No, sir, but—" Clara tried to continue, but he cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Then remember it. You are not paid to have an opinion on how I raise my daughters. You are paid to cook and keep your mouth shut." Richard stood up, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "If you can't do that, perhaps it's time to find another job." The threat hung in the air like a sharp blade. Clara felt her legs weaken, but the image of the twins huddled by the window, sick and abandoned, gave her the strength to take one more step. "Sir, they're children. They're your daughters," she said, her voice gaining a firmness that surprised even her. Richard moved closer to Clara until he was inches from her face. "My daughters need to learn that the world is not a kind place, Clara. They need to be strong, resilient. I will not raise weak, spoiled girls." "They're 2 years old, Mr. Sterling," Clara replied, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. 2 years old. For a moment, something wavered in Richard's gaze. A shadow of doubt, perhaps of pain, flashed across his eyes. But it was only a moment. The cold mask was back in place, doubly reinforced. "This conversation is over. Go back to the kitchen and do not interfere in matters that are not your concern." Clara retreated, defeated but not broken. She knew she had lost this battle, but the war was not yet over. As she walked back to the kitchen, an iron determination settled in her heart. If she couldn't save the girls through words, she would find another way. In the pasture, the white horse had witnessed the entire scene through the open window. Its animal instincts picked up on the tension, the pain, the injustice that permeated the house. It paced nervously along the fence line, its hooves leaving deep prints in the damp earth. Something was wrong. Profoundly wrong, and it could feel it in every fiber of its being. The twins, oblivious to the confrontation that had taken place in the dining room, continued their chores with the silent determination of the condemned. Maya carried Lena whenever she stumbled, whispering words of encouragement she had learned from watching the horse's tenderness toward them. "Be strong, Lena," she would murmur, her own wobbly legs supporting her sister's weight. "Our friend is watching us. We have to be brave for him." Lena would nod weakly, her eyes automatically seeking the window where she knew she would find the silent comfort of her four-legged protector. And there he was, still as a statue, but with eyes that conveyed all the strength and love they needed. It was at that moment that something no one expected happened. Lena, exhausted beyond any human limit, simply collapsed. Her small body fell to the marble floor like a rag doll, and she lay there, motionless, her breathing faint and shallow. Maya screamed, a sharp, desperate sound that echoed through the mansion like an alarm. The scream brought Clara running from the kitchen, John from the gardens, and even Richard from his office. But it was the horse that reacted first. Its loud, anguished whinny cut through the air like a blade, and it began to gallop in circles in the pasture, clearly agitated. It was as if it knew its little friend was in mortal danger. Clara knelt beside Lena, touching her forehead, which was burning like fire. "My God, she's burning up," she murmured, looking at Richard with pleading eyes. "Sir, please, she needs medical help now." Richard stood frozen, staring at his unconscious daughter on the floor. For the first time in months, his mask of coldness completely faltered. There was a child, his child, who could be dying, and suddenly all his justifications about discipline and strength seemed empty and cruel. Maya knelt beside her sister, taking her cold little hand and whispering, "Lena, wake up. The horse is waiting for us at the window. Wake up, please." The moment stretched into an eternity, charged with a tension that could break hearts and change destinies. It was clear that a point of no return had been reached, and that the decisions made in the next few moments would determine the future of everyone involved in this silent tragedy. The storm that had been brewing for days finally broke with all its fury on the night Lena collapsed. Lightning cut through the sky like silver knives, and thunder rattled the estate with an intensity that made the windows shake. It was as if the heavens themselves were outraged by the injustice they were witnessing. Lena had been taken to the small back room where the girls slept, but her condition remained critical. Clara had managed to lower her fever slightly with cool compresses, but it was obvious the child needed medical care she couldn't receive at the mansion. Maya wouldn't leave her sister's side, holding her small hand and humming the same soft melodies the white horse used to make for them. Richard had locked himself in his office after the incident, fighting internal demons he had tried to keep buried for years. The image of Lena passed out on the marble floor refused to leave his mind, echoing with memories of his wife in her final days. He drank whiskey straight from the bottle, trying to drown a pain that was rising like a tidal wave in his chest. Outside, the white horse was displaying an agitation never seen before. It galloped through the soaked pasture, stopping only to stare intently at the mansion. Its whinnies cut through the night like battle cries. And it began to do something that left John stunned. It repeatedly tried to jump the fence, separating it from the house. "I've never seen anything like it," John murmured to Clara as they watched the animal from the kitchen window. "It's like he knows he has to do something." Clara glanced at the clock. It was almost 2 in the morning. The storm seemed to be at its peak, and Lena had worsened in the last few hours. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and even unconscious. She moaned softly in pain. It was then that Clara made the bravest decision of her life. "John," she said, turning to the gardener with iron resolve, "we're taking the girls to Dr. Evans now." "But Clara, in this storm, and the boss is drunk in his office, and this child will die if we do nothing." Clara was already moving, gathering towels and a basket with basic supplies. "I can't stand by and watch these children suffer anymore." John hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He too had reached his limit. Together, they went to the little room where the girls were. Maya looked at them with large, frightened eyes when they entered. "Aunt Clara, Lena is so quiet," she whispered, her little voice thick with worry. "I know, my dear. We're going to take her to a place where they can take good care of her," Clara said, wrapping Lena in warm towels. The child was so light, she felt like a wounded bird. It was at that moment that the impossible happened. A deafening crash echoed across the property, not thunder, but the sound of splintering wood. The white horse had managed to break down part of the fence and was galloping directly toward the mansion. John ran to the window, unable to believe his eyes. "Clara, and come see this." The horse had stopped directly in front of the mansion's main door. It pawed at the soaked ground and whinnied loudly, as if calling for someone. Its eyes shone with an intelligence that seemed almost human, and there was something in its posture that suggested purpose, determination. "He wants to help," Maya said, with the absolute certainty of a child. "He came to get us." Clara looked at John, and they both had the same impossible realization. The horse had truly come to offer help. It was as if it understood that this was the night. Everything had to change. "Do you think?" John began to ask, but Clara was already moving. "We have no choice. The road is too flooded for the car, and carrying the girls on foot in this storm would be impossible." She looked at the horse through the window. "If he's offering—" Carefully, they exited the mansion through the back door. The horse saw them approach and stood completely still, as if understanding the delicacy of the situation. When Clara got close with Lena in her arms, the animal lowered its head slightly, in a gesture that seemed almost like a bow. "He understands," Marina whispered, touching the horse's neck in awe. "He knows Lena needs help." With a gentleness that was stunning for an animal of its size, the horse allowed Clara to place Lena on its back. Maya climbed up behind her sister, holding her tightly. The horse remained perfectly still throughout the process, as if it were made of marble. "Dr. Evans lives 2 miles from here," John shouted over the noise of the rain. "Can you make it?" The horse let out a low nicker that sounded almost like an affirmative answer. Clara kissed Maya's forehead and whispered, "Hold on to your sister tight, my dear. You're going to be okay." And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, the horse began to walk through the torrential rain. Its steps were steady but careful, each movement calculated not to disturb its precious passengers. Maya hugged Lena tightly, whispering words of encouragement as the rain poured down on them. Clara and John stood at the door, watching until the 3 figures disappeared into the darkness of the stormy night. It was the most beautiful and saddest scene they had ever witnessed. 2 children being carried to safety by a 4-legged angel who had decided it was time to act. Inside the mansion, Richard remained lost in his demons, unaware that his life was about to change forever. Dr. Edward Evans was having a sleepless night, organizing medications in his veterinary clinic when he heard something impossible. The sound of hooves approaching in the middle of the storm. As a vet for over 20 years in this small town, he knew the local animals well, but he had never known a horse to venture out willingly in such a violent storm. Intrigued, he went to the window, and what he saw took his breath away. A magnificent white horse was standing in front of his clinic, and on its back, children, 2 small girls, one hugging the other, both soaked by the rain. Edward didn't hesitate. He grabbed a flashlight and ran out into the storm, his mind already shifting from vet mode to the emergency mode he had learned over years of treating both animals and people in a town where doctors were scarce. "My God," he murmured when he got close enough to see the girls' condition. The smaller one seemed unconscious, her tiny body limp in her older sister's arms. "What happened to you?" Maya looked at him with large, frightened eyes, but there was also a desperate hope in her gaze. "Can you help my sister?" "She's really sick." Edward's heart broke. He recognized the girls. Everyone in town knew who the daughters of the powerful Richard Sterling were, though few had seen them in person. But to see the children in this state, brought by a horse in the middle of a storm, told a story he didn't want to believe. "Of course I can, sweetie," he said in the softest voice he could manage. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." With infinite care, Edward lifted the girls from the horse's back. Lena was burning with fever, and her breathing was weak and shallow. Maya, though conscious, was trembling from both cold and fever, but refused to let go of her sister's hand. The horse stood still, watching his every move with intense focus. As Edward started walking toward the clinic with the girls in his arms, the animal followed, as if wanting to make sure its charges would be safe. "Isabel!" Edward shouted into the house. "Isabel, I need your help!" Isabel Evans, Edward's daughter and a nursing student, appeared quickly, still in her bathrobe. At 22, she had inherited both her father's compassion and his knack for handling emergencies. One look was enough for her to grasp the gravity of the situation. "Dad, these girls are in critical condition," she said, already rushing to get medical supplies. "The little one is showing signs of severe dehydration and possible pneumonia." Edward carried the twins to what he affectionately called the miracle room, a room at the back of the clinic he had equipped for human emergencies, as he was often sought out by families who couldn't afford to go to the city. While father and daughter worked to stabilize Lena, Maya refused to move away. Even shaking with fever, she held her sister's hand and whispered words of encouragement. "Aunt, he brought you here, didn't he?" Maya asked, referring to the horse, her voice weak but full of admiration. "Our friend saved us." Edward stopped what he was doing and looked at the girl. "Sweetie, are you saying the horse brought you here all by himself?" Maya nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He knew Lena needed help. He always knew. Isabel exchanged a meaningful look with her father. They had both worked with animals long enough to know that they occasionally displayed an intelligence and compassion that defied scientific explanation. But this was extraordinary. Outside, the horse had found shelter under a small porch, but its eyes remained fixed on the clinic door. It was like a guardian, determined not to leave until it was sure its charges were safe. As Edward and Isabel worked tirelessly to bring down Lena's fever and treat her dehydration, Maya finally allowed them to care for her as well. It was the first time in months that anyone had touched her with kindness, that someone cared about her pain instead of demanding she ignore it. "Shh, it's all right now," Isabel whispered as she cleaned the wounds on Maya's small hands. "You're safe here." The word safe made Maya start to cry, not from pain, but from relief. It was a feeling she had almost forgotten, the sense that someone cared, that someone wanted to protect them instead of hurt them. As the night wore on, Lena began to show signs of improvement. Her breathing became more regular, and her fever started to come down. Edward administered fluids and medication with the precision of someone who had saved countless lives, while Isabel hummed softly to soothe the girls. "Are they going to be okay?" Maya asked, as the first ray of sun began to peek through the storm clouds. "Yes, they are." "Sweetie," Edward replied, gently stroking the girl's hair. "You are very brave children." Maya smiled, her first genuine smile in months. "It wasn't just us. Our friend helped us." Edward looked out the window, where the white horse still kept its vigil. The animal had stood there all night, a four-legged guardian angel. It was one of the most beautiful and mysterious things he had ever witnessed. But Edward knew the hardest part was just beginning. These children had clearly suffered terrible abuse, and he would have to make decisions that could change not only their lives, but the life of the entire community. Richard Sterling was a powerful man, and interfering in his family affairs would have consequences. Still, looking at the two small figures sleeping in his clinic, Edward knew there was no choice. Some things were more important than power or money. And the lives of two innocent children were definitely at the top of that list. The dawn brought more than just the end of the storm. It brought the discovery that would change everything. Richard woke up in his office with a pounding headache and the empty whiskey bottle beside the leather armchair where he'd spent the night. For a moment, reality seemed distant, hazy like the alcoholic fumes still in his system. It was the silence that first alerted him. A different kind of silence, too empty. Even on his cruelest mornings, there was always the distant sound of small footsteps, the dragging of rags on the floor, the low whispers of the twins as they performed their endless chores. Stumbling slightly, Richard went to the small back room where the girls slept. The door was open, the beds empty, the few clothes they owned scattered on the floor as if they had left in a hurry. "Clara!" His shout echoed through the mansion with a fury that made the windows tremble. "Clara!" The cook appeared quickly, but her face was different. Where there was once fearful submission, there was now something Richard had never seen: quiet defiance. "Where are my daughters?" The question came out as a roar, but Clara didn't shrink back as she always did. "They're being cared for, sir. As they should have been a long time ago," she answered. Her voice trembling but firm. "Cared for? By whom? Where are they?" Clara took a deep breath, steeling herself for the moment that would change her life forever. "With Dr. Evans, Lena was dying. Mr. Sterling, dying." The word dying hit Richard like a punch to the gut. For an instant, something like panic flashed in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a rage that seemed capable of setting the mansion itself on fire. "You took my daughters off this property without my permission." Each word was spat like venom. "You kidnapped my daughters." "I saved your daughters," Clara replied, finding a courage she didn't know she possessed. "Because you weren't saving them." Richard advanced on her, but John appeared in the kitchen doorway, positioning himself beside Clara. The gardener was a strong man, hardened by years of manual labor, and his presence served as a silent reminder that Clara was not alone. "You're both fired," Richard said, his voice dangerously low. "Get off my property now, before I call the police and have you charged with kidnapping." "Call the police," Clara said, surprising even herself with her audacity. "Tell them about the condition your daughters were in. Explain why two-year-old children had to be rescued in the middle of the night." For a moment, Richard was speechless. The idea that his employees, people he considered as insignificant as furniture, could question him this way was something he had never thought possible. But Richard Sterling hadn't built an empire by being easily defeated. Quickly, his calculating mind went to work, formulating a strategy to turn the situation to his advantage. "Kidnapping," he said, picking up the phone. "That's what I'll report. 2 disgruntled employees kidnapped my daughters during a storm, probably for money." Clara felt the blood run cold in her veins, but she didn't back down. "No one will believe that when they see the state the girls are in." "Won't they?" Richard smiled, but it was a smile without warmth, pure calculated cruelty. "Clara, do you really think anyone in this town is going to challenge my version of the facts? I employ half the population, directly or indirectly. I fund the sheriff's campaign, I contribute to the church, I sustain the local economy." The truth of Richard's words hit Clara like stones. He was right. In a small town where job opportunities were scarce and survival depended on the goodwill of the powerful, few would risk crossing him. As Richard made his phone calls, mobilizing his network of influence, the white horse had returned to the property. But something had changed in him. The animal paced nervously in the pasture, its eyes fixed on the mansion, as if sensing the danger its small friends still faced. At Dr. Evans's clinic, the twins slept peacefully for the first time in months. Lena had been stable through the night, her fever finally dropping to safe levels. Maya rested beside her sister, her small hands finally relaxed, free from the constant tremors of fear and exhaustion. Edward, however, couldn't sleep. He knew it was only a matter of time before Richard found out where his daughters were, and when he did, the previous night's thunderstorm would seem like a gentle breeze compared to the human storm that was about to break. Isabel entered the room where the girls were resting, carrying a tray with warm oatmeal and milk. "How are they?" she asked softly. Physically, they'll recover, Edward answered, but his voice carried a deep concern. But, honey, I'm afraid of what will happen when... The sound of approaching cars cut off his words. Edward looked out the window and felt his heart race. 2 police cruisers were parking in front of his clinic, and Richard Sterling was getting out of a black luxury car, his face a mask of authority and staged indignation. "It's time," Edward murmured, kissing the foreheads of the sleeping girls. "Isabel, don't let anyone wake them." No matter what happens, the confrontation that would determine the twins, fate was about to begin, and Edward knew he was fighting not just a man, but an entire system that protected the powerful at the expense of the defenseless. Sheriff Martins got out of his cruiser with an uncomfortable expression. He was a middle-aged man who had known Edward since they were kids, and the idea of investigating the most respected vet in town for kidnapping seemed absurd. But orders were orders, especially when they came from Richard Sterling. "Edward," he greeted, tipping his hat, "I'm sorry to be here under these circumstances." "Martins," Edward replied calmly, positioning himself in the doorway of his clinic like a protective shield. "I'd imagine so." Richard stepped forward, his presence dominating the small space in front of the clinic. He was impeccably dressed. Every detail of his appearance calculated to project authority and respectability. He was the perfect picture of a concerned father seeking justice. "Sheriff, I demand this man be arrested immediately," Richard declared, pointing at Edward. "He kidnapped my daughters during last night's storm. God knows what he intends to do with them." Edward felt a wave of nausea at the blatant manipulation of the situation, but he kept his voice firm. "The girls are safe and being cared for. They arrived here in critical condition. Richard, Lena nearly died." "Lies!" Richard exclaimed, his performance worthy of a seasoned actor. "My daughters were perfectly fine at home. This man took them from their beds during a violent storm. It's a miracle they didn't die of hypothermia." Sheriff Martins looked from one man to the other, clearly torn between what his gut was telling him and what his position required him to do. He had known Edward for decades. He was a man of unimpeachable character, but he also knew the power Richard held in the region. "Edward, I need to see the children," Martin said finally, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Of course," Edward replied, but he didn't move from the doorway. "But first, Martins, take a good look at this man and tell me, when was the last time you saw him show any fatherly concern for these girls?" The question hung in the air like a silent accusation. It was true that no one in town had ever seen Richard with his daughters, not at church, not at the park, not at any community event. The children were like ghosts in the life of the most powerful man in the region. "That's irrelevant," Richard said quickly. "I'm a busy man, with responsibilities that support this entire town. That doesn't give me any less right as a father." At that moment, Isabel appeared at the door beside her father. She was holding a digital camera, a brave decision she had made during the night. "Perhaps the sheriff would like to see these photos before making any decisions," she said, holding the camera out to Martins. The photographs told a story that no words could deny: small, bruised, and calloused hands, malnourished bodies, marks from chemical cleaners on delicate skin, eyes sunken with exhaustion. It was irrefutable documentation of the suffering the twins had endured. Sheriff Martin's face went pale as he scrolled through each photo. Even the younger deputy accompanying him swallowed hard at the sight of the images. These were not normal, healthy children. They were victims of something terrible. This is unconscionable," Martins murmured. His voice filled with horror. Richard tried to see the photos, but Martins kept the camera out of his reach. "Those photos are forged," Richard declared, though he couldn't see them. This man is trying to frame me with fake evidence. Mr. Sterling, Martin said slowly, his demeanor visibly shifting, I need to ask you some very serious questions about the condition of your daughters. It was then that Maya appeared in the doorway, drawn by the loud voices. She was wearing a clean nightgown that Isabel had found for her, and though she was still pale, there was a serenity on her face that hadn't been there for months. Maya, Richard said, opening his arms in a theatrical display of paternal affection. Daddy came to get you and Lena. Let's go home. The little girl's reaction was instant and revealing. She flinched back immediately, her eyes filling with terror, and ran behind Edward, clinging to his legs as if her life depended on it. Don't want to go home, she said, her voice small but clear. Please, don't make me go back. The moment was devastating in its simplicity. No 2-year-old should have that reaction to seeing her own father. The fear in her eyes was real, visceral, impossible to fake or manufacture. Martins watched the scene with growing horror. His own daughters ran into his arms whenever they saw him. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. She's confused, Richard said quickly, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Traumatized by the kidnapping, she needs to be home to recover. Recover from what, exactly, Mr. Sterling? Edward asked, his voice gaining strength. From the forced labor, the starvation, the chemical burns, the fever that nearly killed her because she received no medical care? Each accusation hit Richard like a bullet, but he maintained his facade of indignation. Slander, all of it slander. My daughters are well cared for, spoiled even. Then explain these photos, Martin said, his voice now laced with police authority. Explain why a 2-year-old has calluses on her hands. Explain why they were in a state of malnutrition. The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Richard looked around, realizing the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The narrative he had so carefully constructed was crumbling in the face of evidence he couldn't deny. From the nearby pasture, the white horse watched the scene with intense focus. As if sensing that this was the crucial moment in his little friends' lives, he approached the fence, his eyes fixed on the group of people who would decide the twins' fate. Sheriff, Edward said calmly, I suggest we all speak privately. There's a lot more you need to know about these children's situation. It was time for the truth to emerge completely, no matter how powerful the man trying to keep it buried was. The private conversation took place in the small living room of Dr. Evans's house, far from curious ears and the little ones who were finally resting safely. Sheriff Martins sat in an armchair. The photographs spread across the coffee table like pieces of a puzzle, revealing a disturbing truth. Richard maintained his defensive posture, but cracks were beginning to show in his indignant facade. Edward and Isabel provided medical details that were impossible to dispute. The levels of malnutrition, the injuries consistent with forced labor, the signs of extreme stress in such young children. Mr. Sterling, Martin said slowly, the evidence is very clear. These children have been subjected to conditions that no child should ever face. It's an elaborate lie, Richard insisted, but his voice had lost its earlier force. This man wants to destroy my reputation. Maybe he's being paid by my competitors. It was at that moment that Clara and John arrived at the clinic. They had walked the 2 miles from the mansion, carrying a bag with the girls, few clothes, and something even more important, the testimony of other employees who had finally found the courage to speak. Sheriff, Clara said as she entered the room, we brought other people who saw what happened in that house. Behind her came Mary, the housekeeper, and Peter, Richard's private driver. Both were visibly nervous but determined. The presence of multiple witnesses completely changed the dynamic of the situation. They saw the girls mopping the floors at 5 in the morning, Mary began, her voice trembling but firm. 2-year-old children, Sheriff, with high fevers, stumbling with exhaustion, but forced to work. Peter nodded gravely. I heard the screaming, Sheriff. The threats. I saw how they would hide whenever the boss came home. Each testimony was another nail in the coffin of Richard's story. Sheriff Martins looked from one person to another, his expression growing darker with each revelation. You're all conspiring against me, Richard said, but his voice sounded desperate now. You all worked for me. This is betrayal, ingratitude. No, sir, Clara said with a dignity that surprised everyone, including herself. This is called having a conscience. During this conversation, Lena had woken up and asked for her sister. Isabel brought them into the room, and the sight of the 2 girls, clean, fed, but still obviously fragile, had a visceral impact on everyone present. Lena, for the first time in months, didn't have a fever. Her eyes, though still tired, had a sparkle that had been absent for a long time. Maya held her hand protectively, but there was less tension in her small shoulders. How are you girls feeling? Sheriff Martins asked gently, kneeling to be at their level. Better, Maya answered simply. Nobody yelled at us today. The simplicity of the observation was devastating. It was an innocent confession that revealed a warped normality. For these children, not being yelled at was a cause for celebration. And would you like to go back home? Martins asked, carefully watching their reactions. Both girls shook their heads no, instinctively moving closer to Edward and Isabel. The fear in their eyes when they looked at Richard was unmistakable. It was then that something unexpected happened. Outside, the white horse began to nicker loudly and insistently. He had moved up to the window and was visibly agitated, as if sensing the tension inside the house. Our friend, Lena whispered, running to the window. He's worried about us. Maya followed, and they both waved at the horse, who immediately calmed upon seeing them. The connection between the children and the animal was so obvious that not even Richard could deny it. That horse, Maya explained to the sheriff with the seriousness of a child. He saved us. He knew Lena was going to get very sick. Martins looked through the window at the magnificent white animal and shook his head in admiration. It seems you have a very special guardian angel. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed. Richard was isolated. His lies exposed by multiple witnesses and irrefutable evidence. But more important than that was the visible transformation in the children themselves. In just a few hours away from the environment of terror, they were already showing signs of emotional recovery. They giggled softly with Isabel, accepted affection, and showed a natural curiosity about the world around them. It was like watching wilted flowers begin to bloom again. Mr. Sterling, Sheriff Martin said finally, I'm opening an official investigation into child abuse. The girls will be placed under state protection until this situation is resolved. You can't do that, Richard exploded, his mask of composure finally shattering completely. I am their father. I have rights. Rights you gave up when you chose to treat your daughters like servants, Edward said calmly. Children have the right to safety, to health, to love. Things you denied them. For the first time in the conversation, Richard was truly speechless. He looked at his daughters, who were hugging by the window, whispering to the white horse, and something moved in his hardened chest. It was remorse, guilt, and maybe, just maybe, the belated start of a parental conscience. But it was too late for tears or regrets. The decisions had been made, and the twins' future would be determined by justice, not by the will of a man who had lost the right to be called a father. Outside, the white horse remained on vigil, as if knowing its mission was not yet complete. The news spread through the small town like wildfire. The powerful Richard Sterling, the man many considered untouchable, was being investigated for abusing his own daughters. Tongues wagged tirelessly, whispering on every corner, in every shop, on every bench in the town square. In the empty mansion, Richard walked the hallways that echoed with a deafening silence. For the first time in months, there were no small footsteps, no low whispers, no sound of rags dragging across the marble floor. The absence of the twins created a void he didn't know how to fill. He stopped before the panoramic window where he had so often caught the girls waving to the white horse. There were the prints of their small hands on the glass, almost invisible impressions that now seemed like silent accusations. Slowly, like a man waking from a nightmare, Richard began to realize what he had done. The memories he had tried to suppress began to surface. Maya carrying Lena when she could no longer walk, their eyes shining with fever as they cleaned the floor. The whispered words of encouragement one offered the other in the hardest moments. "My God," he murmured, leaning against the wall. What have I done?" At Dr. Evans's clinic, the twins were experiencing something they had almost forgotten: childhood. Isabel had brought out some simple toys, and it was touching to see how they examined them with cautious curiosity, as if unsure what to do with objects created just for fun. "It's a dolly," Lena said with awe, gently holding a teddy bear Isabel had given her. "You can hug it," Maya explained to her sister, demonstrating how to hold the toy. It was stunning how, despite being only a few minutes older, she naturally assumed the role of protector and guide. Edward watched the girls play, his heart both breaking and mending at the same time. It was beautiful to see their capacity for recovery, but painful to think of all they had lost. 2-year-olds should be discovering the world through play, not through forced labor and fear. Doctor," Maya approached him with the growing confidence of a child who finally feels safe. "Can our friend come visit?" Edward glanced out the window, where the white horse kept its constant vigil. "Of course he can, sweetie. How about we go outside?" The twins' reaction was pure joy. For the first time, they could be near their friend without glass or fences between them. Edward took them to the small garden behind the clinic, and the horse immediately approached the fence that separated the properties. The reunion was magical. The horse lowered its head so the girls could touch him, and they petted him with a tenderness that showed the deep bond they had developed. There were no words to describe the connection between the three creatures who had suffered and found solace in one another. "He's our hero," Lena said simply, kissing the horse's muzzle. Isabel, who was documenting everything with her camera, felt tears stream down her face. It was one of the purest and most beautiful scenes she had ever witnessed. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office, the official paperwork was being processed. Sheriff Martins had contacted Child Protective Services in the neighboring county, explaining the situation and requesting immediate intervention. The photographs and witness testimonies built a solid case that would be impossible to dispute. "It's one of the clearest cases of child abuse I've ever seen," said the social worker who came from the state capital to assess the situation. "These children were subjected to conditions that violate every child protection law on the books." The news hit the local papers by the end of the day. A courageous reporter decided the story was too important to be suppressed, regardless of Richard's power. The headline was simple but devastating. Local tycoon investigated for abuse of 2-year-old daughters. The community's reaction was immediate and profound. People who had worked for Richard, who had benefited from his economic influence, began to question what they really knew about the man behind the fortune. Many remembered signs they had ignored: the children never seen in public, the complete absence of family references, the isolation of the mansion. Clara, brave in her new freedom, gave an interview that touched hearts across the region. "I regret staying silent for so long," she said, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Those girls deserve to have someone speak up for them much sooner. Back at the mansion, Richard received a call that would change everything. It was his lawyer, informing him that the investigation had become official and that criminal charges would be filed. But more important than the legal consequences was what was happening inside him. Alone for the first time in years, with no employees to intimidate or daughters to control, Richard was forced to confront the man he had become. He went up to the attic where the twins had found the photo album, and Che, with trembling hands, flipped through the pages that documented a happier time. There was his wife, radiant with happiness, holding the newborns. There was he himself, smiling with a genuine joy he had forgotten he was capable of feeling. And there were Maya and Lena, innocent babies who looked at the world with eyes full of trust and love. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the photographs, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, my love. I'm sorry, girls. I destroyed everything." It was the first time in 2 years that Richard truly cried, and the tears fell like rain on the photos of a family he had shattered with his own hands. The powerful, feared, and respected man had become a broken father who finally understood the magnitude of his cruelty. But some things, once broken, cannot be fixed, and lost time, especially in the life of a child, can never be recovered. 3 weeks had passed since the night of the storm that changed everything. The official investigation had moved forward quickly, driven by the clarity of the evidence and the growing courage of witnesses who had finally found the voice to speak the truth. At Dr. Evans's clinic, which had become a temporary home for the twins, Maya and Lena were flourishing like flowers that had finally received sun after a harsh winter. Their faces had gained the rosy cheeks of healthy childhood, their laughter echoed through the hallways, and they displayed the natural curiosity of 2-year-olds who were truly discovering the world for the first time. "Dr. Edward," Maya called out one sunny morning, "can I give a carrot to our friend?" The relationship between the twins and the white horse had deepened even further. The animal had practically moved into the pasture adjacent to the clinic, as if he were a self-appointed guardian. Every day, the girls spent hours with him, brushing his mane, offering treats, or simply talking to him as they would a protective older brother. Isabel had meticulously documented the girls' recovery, not just for legal purposes, but because she wanted to preserve the beauty of their transformation. The photographs told a story of rebirth, children who were learning to smile again, to play, to trust. "Dad," Isabel said one afternoon, showing her father her latest photos, "look how much they've changed. It's almost impossible to believe they're the same children who arrived here that night." Edward nodded, emotional. He had seen many cases of recovery in his career as a veterinarian, but he had never witnessed a transformation as complete and touching as the twins. The court had scheduled the final hearing for that week. The case had drawn regional attention, and journalists from larger cities were covering what many were calling the case that woke an entire community to the reality of child abuse. Richard Vaux, who had remained in seclusion at the mansion since the investigation began, finally made a decision that surprised even his lawyer. He contacted Sheriff Martins and requested a meeting. "I want to confess," he said, his voice heavy with an exhaustion that went far beyond the physical. "I want everything on the official record, every mistake, every moment of cruelty, every lost opportunity to be the father they deserved." The confession was detailed and painful. Richard recounted how the grief over his wife's loss had twisted into resentment against his daughters, how he had gradually increased his impossible expectations, how he had justified his cruelty as necessary discipline. "I destroyed their childhood," he said, tears streaming freely down his face. I turned two innocent children into little slaves because I couldn't deal with my own pain. Sheriff Martins, though a man hardened by years of police work, was touched by the sincerity of Richard's remorse. But remorse, however genuine, did not erase years of suffering. "What do you want to happen now?" Martins asked. "I want them to be with people who will love them as I should have," Richard answered without hesitation. I want to officially relinquish my parental rights, and I want my entire fortune to be placed in a trust fund to ensure they have everything they need for a happy life." Richard's decision was communicated to Dr. Evans, who had become not just the twins' medical caregiver, but a genuine father figure. When Child Protective Services suggested that he and Isabel consider formal adoption, the response was immediate and emotional. "It would be an honor," Edward said, hugging the girls he already considered his daughters of the heart. "It would be the greatest honor of our lives." The legal formalities were processed with unusual speed, facilitated by Richard's full confession and the unanimous support of the community. The twins' story had touched hearts across the region, and donations poured in daily to help with their new life. On the day of the final hearing, a crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Clara, John, Mary, Peter, and dozens of other townspeople came to show their support for the girls and for those who had fought to save them. "This is a historic day," the judge declared upon finalizing the proceedings, "not only for the justice served to two innocent children, but for the example of how a community can unite to protect its most vulnerable members." When they left the courthouse, Maya and Lena ran immediately to where the white horse was waiting for them. Brought especially for the occasion, the animal had been officially adopted by the Evans family, ensuring the special trio would never be separated again. "Our friend has a new family now too," Lena said, hugging the horse's neck with the pure joy of childhood. Maya, ever more serious, looked up at Edward with those big eyes that had seen too much suffering, but now shone with hope. "Daddy Edward," she said, testing the sound of the words. "Thank you for saving us." Edward knelt to be at her level, his own tears falling freely. "You saved yourselves, sweetie, with courage, love for each other, and with the help of a very special friend." He glanced at the white horse, who seemed to smile in his own animal way. "We all just recognized something that was always true. You deserve to be loved." The crowd applauded as the new family headed for home. The twins walking beside the horse as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was a procession of triumph, a celebration of the victory of love over cruelty, of justice over power, of hope over despair. Behind them, Richard watched from a distance, hidden among the trees. He had no right to be there, no right to share in the joy he had nearly destroyed, but he needed to see one last time that his daughters were truly safe and loved. When he saw them laugh and run freely, finally being the children they were always meant to be, he whispered one last word of gratitude to the winds. "Thank you for taking better care of them than I ever did." And then he walked away, forever carrying the weight of his mistakes, but also the peace of knowing his daughters would have the bright future they deserved. 6 months had passed since the day of the trial, and spring brought with it a renewal that went far beyond the flowers blooming in the fields around the small town. At the Evanses' house, which now officially housed a family of 4 and one very special horse, life blossomed with a joy that seemed contagious to everyone around. Maya and Lena had transformed completely, not just physically, though their rosy cheeks and healthy bodies were a testament to proper nutrition and loving care, but emotionally. They laughed loudly, asked endless questions about everything they saw, and displayed the insatiable curiosity typical of children their age. "Daddy Edward!" Lena shouted one sunny morning, running into the kitchen where he was making breakfast. "Ghost wants to go for a ride today." Ghost was the name the twins had given the horse, a simplicity that perfectly captured the purity of their connection to the animal. The horse had adapted magnificently to his new life, grazing freely on the expanded property and serving as the girls' constant companion. "Of course we can go for a ride," Edward replied, kissing the top of Lena's head. "But first, let's all have breakfast together." The family's morning routine had become a sacred ritual. They would sit at the kitchen table. Isabel would tell funny stories about her nursing studies, and the twins would share their dreams from the night before. It was everything a family should be: warm, loving, and full of laughter and plans for the future. Maya, who had developed a passion for drawing, proudly showed off her latest masterpiece, a family of 4 standing next to a white horse, all smiling under a giant yellow sun. "That's us," she explained with the seriousness of a master artist. "It's our happy family." Isabel felt tears of joy well up in her eyes. The children's ability to overcome trauma and embrace happiness was a daily lesson in resilience and hope. The transformation wasn't limited to the Evans family. The entire town had undergone a profound change. The twins' case had awakened a collective consciousness about child protection, and several initiatives had sprung up to ensure no child in the region would go unnoticed or unprotected again. Clara, who now worked as the coordinator of a new community center for families in need, had found her true purpose in life. "I will never again stay silent when a child needs help," she declared in an interview with the local paper. "The girls taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it." John had become the official caretaker of the Evans property, but more importantly, he had developed an animal-assisted therapy program where Ghost helped other traumatized children find comfort and healing. Richard's mansion had been sold, and the money, as promised, was put into a trust fund for the twins. But the real transformation had happened to the building itself. The new owner, a non-profit organization, had converted the mansion into a shelter for at-risk children, turning a place of suffering into a sanctuary of hope. Richard had left town, but not before writing a letter to his daughters, a letter Edward was keeping safe for when they were older and could decide if they wanted to read it. In it, he took full responsibility for his mistakes and expressed his infinite gratitude to those who had given his daughters the love he had failed to offer. On a particularly beautiful afternoon, the family decided to have a picnic in the same pasture where it all began. The twins ran freely through the grass, playing hide-and-seek with Ghost, who participated in the game with the infinite patience of an older brother. "It's hard to believe that just a few months ago," Isabel began, but Edward shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Today is about today, about the future, about all the possibilities that lie ahead for them." As if he'd heard, Maya ran up to them, her eyes shining with excitement. "Daddy Edward, when I grow up, I want to help kids like you helped us." Lena nodded vigorously. "And I want to take care of horses like Ghost takes care of us." Edward looked at his daughters of the heart and saw in them not just survivors, but future leaders, future healers, future sources of hope for others who might need saving. "You can be anything you want to be," he said, hugging them both. "The whole world is waiting to see the incredible women you'll become." As the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the family gathered to watch the spectacle. Ghost grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally lifting his head to watch over his small charges with eyes full of love and contentment. "You know," Edward said, looking at the horse, "I think our friend Ghost knew from the beginning how this story would end." Maya followed his gaze. "He knew we were going to be okay." "More than that," Edward replied. He knew you were going to be loved, and that you would grow up to spread that love to the world. The gentle evening breeze carried with it the sound of children's laughter, the contented nicker of a happy horse, and the tangible feeling that sometimes, even in the darkest of circumstances, love finds a way to triumph. In that small town, surrounded by pastures and farms, a story that had begun with suffering and injustice had transformed into a celebration of human kindness, of courage in the face of adversity, and of the transformative power of unconditional love. Maya and Lena, who had once been small shadows dragging rags across a cold marble floor, now ran freely under the sun, their laughter echoing across the property like heavenly music. They had found not just a home, but a family who loved them exactly as they were and would support them in whatever they dreamed of becoming. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, three silhouettes, two small and one majestic, walked slowly toward the house, where warm light shone from the windows and where love had built a sanctuary that no storm could ever destroy. The past had been healed, the present was full of joy, and the future shone with infinite possibilities. It was, truly, a new dawn for everyone involved in this extraordinary journey of pain, redemption, and triumphant love.